today's session, we're going to be discussing design of your website. So I'm actually joined by Johnny. Johnny, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Johnny. I'm head of design here at MediaWorks.
So Johnny, the reason why I've asked you to join us is essentially to talk about what design means when we talk about websites. Because traditionally when we think about design, we do think about the appearance of a website, colors, logos, that visual branding. But from the conversations that we've had previously, design can mean a whole lot more than that. So kind of just an overview of what design means to you. I appreciate it's a really broad question, and trying to encapsulate all of that in a few sentences is going to be difficult, but what do we mean by design, by that term?
Yeah, I think, like you said, design is that broad spectrum. But all we're really thinking of in that space is the sort of UX, the user experience, and the UI, so the user interface and how we kind of design that to aesthetically look. But ultimately, how all of that comes together to form that customer experience, that overall sort of end-to-end journey for the lifetime of your website.
So when you talk about end-to-end journey, like I would assume that there's a start point and there's a finish point as well. So do those start points and end points always look the same? Do they look different?
Yeah, I think fundamentally they're the same. I think whether you're a new business just starting up or an established business, I think those start and end points are the same. I think you might have different objectives of what you want a user to do, primarily through that website, but ultimately you've got the steps of trying to draw a user in, giving them the best experience to hit that goal that they're looking to sort of hit. And then on the back of that, you've got that sort of conversion. How do they make that final sort of, either whether it's buying a product or purchasing something or signing up to something, and then it's building loyalty on the back of that. And I think design touches all of those aspects, because if something's not designed well, you ultimately are going to cut a user off at one of those stages through that process.
So something really interesting that you mentioned there was this idea of getting your users to hit particular goals, but then you also mentioned conversion as well, and the fact that they're not always the same. So what are some of those other goals that we could have in place on our website?
So in terms of goals we can have sort of what we'll class as a macro sort of conversion, or a primary conversion, which will be buying a product or signing up to something or getting in touch about a service. But then there's also kind of smaller goals where we will even try to get maybe a user to sign up to a newsletter, so it becomes more informative. Even if your website might just be something that is building brand awareness or is just there purely as an informational website, there's still a goal there. There might not necessarily be a conversion point where we're asking the user to sign up or give us some information or sort of give a bit of personal detail, but there is always a goal ultimately that we're trying to drive them towards, and a purpose for that website being there and existing.
So in terms of having a process to create a website, so is there a process that we have when we're creating a website from scratch versus redesigning an existing website? Because I appreciate that many of the learners on this short course, some of them might be considering launching a website for the business or for the organization they work within. Meanwhile, many of the learners as well will be within an organization that has a website in place. So for them to kind of take a step back and to review what they have at the moment, do those processes differ and what do they look like?
I think the overarching process is ultimately the same. You want to go into this fully informed, making the right decisions for your users. That sort of process is that analysis. So it is the kind of who, what, where, when, how of your users and the business really, and understand how they do that. The structure of that site, how we structure the pages that exist in that website, then into that design phase. But ultimately it is going into that as informed as possible. If your website is a brand new site, like you say, you may not have that owned data yet, but there is other ways of getting that data. You can have surveys with people, you could reach out to customer base through emails, things like that, to get an understanding of what they're looking for. There's a lot of customer research tools out there to guide you in that instance. If your website does exist and has existed for a while and you're looking to launch a new website, It is a case of taking the data, what are your users doing, how are they utilizing your website right now, what impact on them is the design having, and using that to the best of your advantage to create a new platform that is better informed than your last one. The last thing you want to do is launch with a new website that has exactly the same flaws as your previous one, just looks a little bit better. It's all about what the user wants.
So a term that you use there, own data, what do you mean by that?
So own data is your ability to obtain data naturally through the day-to-day running of your platform or website. So whether that's behavioral data, whether it's your online data through things like Google Analytics or anything like that, or also information obtained through surveys and polls that you might have on your website, or even just your day-to-day chatting with customers, getting a feel, getting an understanding, maybe through live chat, things like that, to get an understanding of how they're utilizing your platform. That is data that you can own without having to make any sort of paid decisions or anything like that. Ultimately, you own it.
Could you give us an example then of the type of survey that you could use to collect that data from your customers or users at least?
Yeah, definitely. So we've ran them previously in the past to make some really strong informed decisions around how we're going to better a platform, better a website, in terms of going out there, asking who the customer is, what is their job role, what are they looking to do today, how are they finding that, how are they utilizing the website to, whether that's a conversion or a fact-finding mission for them, how are they finding that information, and asking them, how do we just better that experience, how aware of the brand they are, things like this. All of this sort of information and questions are ultimately going to feed in and give you a better platform when you come to creating and designing a new website, because you're going to lead into it much more informed, understanding exactly what your users are trying to do, and ultimately giving them a better experience.
So whenever I see kind of a survey or pop-up appear on the website asking me about my experience, is essentially to capture that data to make those informed decisions?
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of people will see them and try and ignore them as much as possible, but you do get some genuine, really good feedback through those interactions. I think you'll obviously always get your sort of hit and miss answers as well, but the feedback you do get is always very honest about what that user's doing, because if that user has a frustration, you want to know about it. Where else are they better to put that frustration than into a pop-up in the bottom corner of the website? So you get very honest feedback, and in a sense, you can then have a metric to go back to your users and say, we've launched a better platform because you wanted this. And it gives you then something to measure against when that new website goes live.
So now that we have that data, what's next?
So there's always going to be points where we have to make that decision between creating a whole new platform or making iterative changes to a website. I think creating that whole new platform is always going to be if there is such wholesale changes in the business or the user group that we just think that fundamentally creating a new journey is a better option. But the other option to that is that iterative change where we can test and learn in the whole process. I think that process is ultimately the best way to go, because you're then making those more informed decisions. The way we kind of do that is to identify an issue that might be happening on the site. Some people might be coming to the website, getting to a certain point and then dropping off at the basket stage. We ultimately want people to finish that purchase, so we want to know why they're dropping off at that stage. We prioritize that as a fix, so we understand that that's probably where we can make the most impact on our website. That's where we're going to get the most revenue through or something like that. It's going to create the best sort of area for us to focus. We need to propose a solution, like you say. We then come up with that new design or new fix that basically implements what we think fixes the issue. But that's where we can't just assume that is the right fix, and we need to really understand how we can move forward with that in this space, but making sure that the users are having their chance to feed in on that. We implement that as a test. So ultimately what we do is kind of utilize some of our software such as Convert, which is going to skin our page to essentially put a like-for-like test between what currently exists and our new proposal of a solution. And that allows us, software like that allows us to understand the impact that page can be had, which then gives us a confident solution to kind of say, yes, this is the right, or maybe on a chance, this is the wrong way of doing it.
So just to come in there, that tool that you just mentioned, what was its name again?
Convert.
So with Convert, what does that do? Does that almost replicate the website with that change in place and then drive users to one version and the other?
So essentially what it does is it, not to get too technical on this, but splits that URL. So splits the URL of the page and pushes some users, once they've allowed cookies, to see either the existing page, how it exists right now, or the new solution that we're proposing, essentially as a mask on that page. So the functionality will be the same, but the design will ultimately be a little bit different. Then we get a like-for-like, unbiased opinion of which one of these works, because we're just directing 50-50 split of that traffic to each of those solutions, whichever one's the better solution, based on the metrics that we've put in place, which would, in an e-commerce world, would be conversions, purchases. That'll ultimately tell us which one of those is more successful, and then we go live with it. It just means that we're moving into that world of informed solution rather than just thinking that's a nicer design and should we go live with that. It means we can ultimately put a return on investment against that and understand the impact that that change has had.
Going back to a point that you made earlier about a user's journey, how people interact on the website and what the journey on the website itself looks like, I imagine that, again, structure is really important when we think about design as well. So is that something that's fair to say?
Yeah, definitely. It's fundamental in kind of how we approach a site, so that obviously the first part of that process is gathering that data, but the second part of that process for us is understanding that structure of how this website's going to work from sort of end to end. Before we get into understanding how people are interacting with a page, we need to know how they flow through the site as a whole. There's a couple of key factors to help sort of build that out, and it is, one, understanding the business goals. What does the business want people to achieve, and what does the business want to achieve from this website? And the other key factor in that is understanding the SEO aspect of it. So it's what are people searching for? Where are they going to enter the website? What pages are going to answer their questions as best possible and most relevant? And then how do we take that user from getting an answer to that question to utilizing the rest of the website and ultimately getting to that conversion or goal point that we want to push them towards?
So far, we've mentioned the importance of collecting data, but then also understanding the structure of a website and how we can use our data to then inform the structure of our site itself. So what's the next stage?
So the next stage from that is the page structure. So it is what we would class as the wireframing stage. Essentially what a wireframe is the design and structure of a page, but without getting hung up on the colors, the brand, the imagery, the context to an extent. Like, we're not going to flow all of the content in there at this point, because really what we're trying to understand is, if a user lands on this page, how are we going to focus them on exactly what they're looking for? So it's really about understanding those sort of smaller journeys, lesser the sort of end-to-end, but how does this page work as part of their journey? So for us, it is just creating that page, making sure we've got that title, making sure we've got the content as high up as possible on that page, that we're going to answer their question as quick as possible, and move them on to the next part of their journey, whatever that may be, as sort of seamlessly as possible.
So it's almost like a journey within a journey itself.
A journey within a journey itself,
it's looking at the structure on the page and how that fits into the structure of a website as well.
Yeah.
So why the term wireframing? Like, what is wireframing?
So wireframe ultimately will look like you've just designed something as some grey boxes.
Right.
But all it is giving us the idea that mainly for our internal testing or very simple testing, just to understand, if a user landed here, are the buttons in the right place? Is the title in the right place? Are they going to see an image at the right time? Things like that. And it just starts to work for us to get a very high level view of how is somebody going to use this page, and are they going to get the information that they need without getting hung up on all of the sort of nice design piece that comes next.
So is it almost as though you're mapping out that journey?
Yeah.
Okay.
So ultimately it's like creating a map of the page.
Okay. Right, that makes sense. So now we've wireframed, correct?
Yep.
What's the next stage then?
The next stage for that for us would be to design that page, or ultimately design the website. So the way we approach approach these projects is that we will take the brand guidelines. So ultimately they'll give us an outline of how the brand should look, the tone of voice that should feed in, the types of imagery that we like to use to make sure that we're on point with that brand. And then it's how do we translate that into a digital online journey. So ultimately we're going to take that, expand on it, but we're at this point adding in the nice imagery, pulling in the sort of nice brand features to now bring this page to life. So now we can get a look and feel for the page that we know is a structure that works because we've looked at it as a map, but now we're actually seeing it brought to life. So, and it's at that point that we probably get that in front of some users to try and test it and get an understanding of how they use it. Are they going to use it in the same way that we envisioned that they would? So ultimately that then feeds in at that point.
Can it be a challenge to kind of look at an individual page, how people interact there versus the entire website and vice versa? Because I'm just trying to imagine now that, even though I wouldn't, because I don't think I'd be capable of doing it, if I was to be part of the design team and there was an issue in the user journey that sat within a particular page. So we've identified where the problem is, that it's on the particular page, people aren't interacting with it the way that we need them to, that's where users are dropping off, so on and so forth, right? So then my assumption would be we'd focus on that page. But then we'd also have to be mindful about how that fits into the bigger journey as well, right?
Yeah, definitely. So as a kind of last point in that sort of 5-stage process, we've got that analysis through the structure and wireframes into the design. Obviously it goes into development, the site will go live, but like you're saying, if we then pick up problems that are happening on a certain page, it's not just a case of going in and changing the design of that page. It is that consideration for how does that feel as part of a journey. It might be the third page that somebody lands to on a website, so are they still seeing that consistency? It might be that we've got some paid adverts driving somebody there, so are those ads still consistent with the changes we're going to make to that page?
Okay.
And ultimately that's where that testing comes in. It is pretty much, we don't want to make a wholesale change to that page and then find out that it's inconsistent with the adverts we've done. It no longer matches the search criteria that people were looking for originally and feels inconsistent with the journey, because ultimately that's going to make the experience worse.
You've raised a really good point there, right? Because we were just joking a little bit earlier about what somebody does on a web page is a journey within the journey on the website. Mm-hmm. But that in itself is within the journey of what somebody's doing online. And like you just mentioned there, if somebody's driven to our website through a paid ad, it could be on social or search, for instance, we have to make sure that our journey all ties in and is consistent throughout.
Yeah.
So when we talk about that consistency, what does that extend to when we think about design then?
So in terms of consistency, it can go anywhere from the look and feel of the page and using those brand elements to make it feel nice, through to the tone of voice that's used. Obviously, we don't want to give them a completely different tone of voice. Similarly, we don't want to give them a totally different call to action. We don't want to be telling somebody to sign up all the way and then they hit a certain page and we're saying contact us, because at that point we're just going to confuse that user journey. And it's just the same with that brand messaging. If we're given some paid ads that hit a specific subject, once a user lands on that page, if they're not seeing similar content, it just confuses that journey. And I think users will ultimately leave the website feeling that there's kind of a lack of trust there at that point. It's not giving me the answers that I want, you're drawing us into the wrong sort of places, and that's the last thing you want to do, is start with a negative aspect.
Yeah, I just think it's really interesting because, you know, originally coming into this session, one of the original questions I had for you was, when we think about design, we think about brands, we think about logos, colors, all the rest of it. When in fact, the majority of what you've been discussing now is that user experience, that journey, which perhaps for many people seems like the more technical aspect. Whereas to just think about the aesthetic of a website is something which we can all kind of easily relate to, because we all have an opinion on what looks good, what doesn't look good. But then on that as well, in terms of opinions, are there some principles that we can kind of abide by, if you will, or a guideline that we have in terms of what makes for good design versus poor design? There's
definitely design principles out there that are good to follow as a starting point. Things like contrast, making sure that your content's legible on the page that it's on, scale, making sure you know the relevant buttons, things like that, are at the right scale. You're not pushing things in people's faces that they're not wanting to see. You're making sure the emphasis is in the right place. I suppose emphasis is a point we can bring in there. There's definitely a list of design sort of principles we can fit in there, but I think it's the best thing to start thinking of is, how are those principles working in terms of your business? I think if you try to put those design principles to two very different businesses, for example, the NHS versus Airbnb, they are going to be two very different sort of approaches. NHS's principles will be all around accessibility, inclusivity, making sure that people find the right information as quickly as possible. They'll probably be less worried around that consistency of a journey, because ultimately people will be going there to find one piece of information and leaving that site. So you may find that it's broken into separate areas, maybe design feels different on different pieces, whereas Airbnb will want to have a very consistent journey. Even though it's a global brand, they'll want every country to feel like they're getting the exact same experience. They'll have a much more conversational tone of voice. So I think design principles in theory are a good thing to make sure that you're sort of capitalizing on some good design skills. But I think not all design principles are going to fit every business. I think it has to be considered with your business, who your users are and what you're trying to achieve within that audience.
So Johnny, now that we've discussed design principles and how those can be slightly different in practice for different organizations, what their goals are, what their audiences are, etc., what's the next stage? Because for me, I imagine that it's really important to understand things from a user experience perspective, to understand what's working, what isn't working. So how can we actually gauge that?
Yeah, so the next sort of stage is, once you have that website live, is that constant monitoring of information and data, and just making sure that the solution you've put out there is right. I think from a design perspective, what you want to know is what areas could potentially be causing issues on the site for the users, what they're responding badly to, what they're responding positively to, and ultimately fixing those sort of negative spaces. So what we understand there is, we would utilize something like Google Analytics to go in, understand that, one, we're getting the right audience in there through the demographic tools. We are targeting the right audience. We then understand where they're coming into the site, and ultimately where they're exiting the site, if that's early in their journey, and ultimately we want them to keep moving through. If there is high exit points, we can see the pages within there that they're kind of exiting on, so we can understand the volumes around that. We then utilize a program or a software such as Hotjar, for example, where we could go in and start to see heat maps. So now what we're doing is, we've understood what pages are causing the issue. We can now see on that page, we can see click maps. So we can see, based on a hot and cold scale, where people are clicking, where they are moving and hovering, and even how far down the page that they're scrolling. So now we can start to see, is our information in the right place? Are people finding it easily? Are they finding that call to action that we think we're guiding them to, but really is it out of people's sort of eye line and they're not quite finding it? And then what we take from that is, within a program, a software such as Hotjar, we'd be able to put session recordings on a page. So as long as somebody allowed those cookies, anonymously, we can see no information about that person, but we get to see them moving around the page. So now we have real life journeys of people on a page that they may be struggling with. So it gives us a real valuable insight in terms of, how are people interacting and what can we do to fix that? So that's when we can start to solutionize our fixes to that problem, and allow us to go into a program like Sketch for our design needs and create a solution that we can ultimately start to test.
When we talk about imagery, when we talk about video, etc., again, are there some guidelines as to how we should use them, when we should use them, where we should use them, when we think about that user journey and what that experience looks like?
Yeah, definitely. I think in terms of what, and I think Natalie would agree with this, is the content is king in that situation. I think it's great to have a website that's aesthetically pleasing, looks great, looks on brand, but ultimately the user's coming for that content, and it's how we design that content and ultimately build that user experience around it. I think an example of how we can show the importance of that content, I think each of those elements has its own sort of level of importance, and I think depending on the user who comes to it is going to get a better result from the text, a better result from imagery, a better use out of video. But I think ultimately an example of how that can be utilized is, say, step-by-step guides. If a user comes to your site, they'll utilize a video of how something is done to get good context. But it's going to be the text that follows it to tell them a step-by-step guide that ultimately they're going to utilize when doing the job that they're looking to do. So it is just getting the right level of use out of those pieces of information. I think ultimately in that user experience, it's just feeding that in at the right time. As we know now, I think YouTube's one of the biggest, if not the biggest website out there. So video content is becoming more and more important. It's now a search metric in Google. So people can search for things and videos will appear in that. So then having that video take somebody through to a page on a website that then reveals an answer just shows how important video can be in that search. It's no longer needs to be the text on a page, it can be the video. So ultimately we are trying to promote that people use a mixture of those pieces of content to ultimately give the best experience to the user.
And do you find that as well, that there is still very much a purpose and there are preferences for different formats of content, just depending on who the audience is and what the goals are as well that you have in mind for your website? Because something that I'm conscious of speaking to a lot of business owners, marketers, etc., is there's a huge emphasis now, like you said, on video content. And a lot of people putting a lot of focus and investment into video, but would you still say there's massive value in still having text and still having imagery, so on and so forth?
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is where we can probably touch on accessibility needs as well. I think video is fantastic and it definitely more than serves a purpose in terms of the user's use of a website. But I think from an accessibility perspective, we need to always consider, I think the stats are 1 in 5 people online today have a disability, which makes it hard for people to use websites. If we put all of our content in videos, it's obviously going to make an impossible journey for them at some stage. So I think making sure that we have clear, consistent content on there that just allows a reader to see that in their own time, take it in their own time and understand it is going to give some people a much better experience than video. Yes, videos, it's fantastic, and if we're putting it out there, we want to put subtitles, things like that, so obviously everybody can access that. But I think ultimately we just need to make sure that at this stage we're understanding the users who are coming to our site and meeting their needs. So it doesn't matter which of the content you use as long as it's the right content for that user.
So Johnny, I'm kind of conscious that a lot of what we've discussed today is being around user journeys, experiences, structures, thinking about how people are interacting on our websites, etc. But just to go back to kind of more traditional design, brand guidelines, how important are those today?
Very. I think they'll give you such a level of consistency for all of the output. I think where we sort of sit with those is they're exactly that, they're a guideline. They're not something that I don't think has to be your gospel of referring back to and sticking to. I think they're an item that changes and evolves with your business. They will outline everything from your brand to your tone of voice to how your logo can be used, how your different sort of brand assets are used, but they're by no way a kind of full stop at the end of that to say this is it. For me, they always evolve, they move with the brand, they move with trends, they move with your business, the scale of how much your business is changing. But they will ultimately give you the consistent feel that you're looking for across your online platforms, your sort of social assets and social ads, even into that more traditional sort of print-based output, just making sure that every aspect of your collateral looks and feels as sort of one suite and gives that, as we mentioned before, consistent journey, whether somebody's coming to you through paid ads or they've seen a flyer. You ultimately want them to land on your website knowing that that brand felt very much the same as those other pieces that they've seen previously.
Yeah, and I guess it ties into, like you said there, everything we're discussing in terms of a customer journey or a user's journey at least, and the fact that there are so many touch points, not just on the website, but across digital, even offline as well, and making sure that there is that consistency there to essentially maximize the efficiency of what we're doing. Because the last thing that we want to do is send somebody down a path, which all of a sudden, there's a bit of distrust there, a bit of anxiety because something isn't quite tying up, even from an aesthetic point of view, visually how it's appearing, which all of a sudden kind of puts a block on that journey and then causes them to drop out as well. So do you think it's fair to say that the significance of both of those is equally as important, like the user journey and the more traditional design element as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think they're equally as important in the fact that you need to use and consider both aspects to have a successful sort of online platform. I think if you're not giving somebody that user experience, ultimately they're not going to have that end goal and make that completion and ultimately get your business to where you want it to be, especially with its online sort of behavior. But if you're not considering those sort of brand essentials and pulling in the sort of that consistent look and feel across everything, you will find that people will start to distrust, and that creates a bit of a taste in the mouth of that user in terms of they may not come back to you if you've got competitors doing the same thing in the same market that they feel that are given a more consistent and better user experience. They're not going to then come back to you for that product, that service. I think there's a stat there, it's 95% of users won't use an outdated website. So it's that idea of always making sure you're on top of not just that user experience, but making sure you're on top of that design element as well, to make sure that people are getting that sort of more modern on-brand sort of feel as your brand evolves, your online platforms evolve, and with that, your user journey evolves. There's no sort of standstill in one of those areas, because that's when things can come crashing down.
Yeah, that actually answers the next question I had for you, which was talking about design visually. How do we know when we need to refresh that? I think you've answered that partially as well in terms of how that can affect the user's journey and how that could potentially put people off from continuing with that particular brand or that particular organization. But how do you know when you perhaps do need to review your branding and what that looks like visually?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different reasons why people would look at the brand. I think a brand should evolve, it should change, it should always sort of be on the move. And that's good use of the brand, understanding as trends change, the way different people react online, the way different people come to expect different things online, visually as well as functionally. I think your brand should change in line with that. Then you're always going to get the businesses that fall behind, that don't stay on top of that, who then have to consider the larger wholesale change of a brand. That's when you kind of go from just having a sort of brand refresh into a brand redesign, because they're then having to consider a lot more than just a couple of changes of their brand elements. They're having to really do a wholesale look at who are our users now, how are they using online, and it's purely just not keeping up with that day-to-day change, just keeping on top of those data sets and understand who your users are. Then you'll always get the businesses that want to create such a change where they go to the extent of Hermes that have changed to Every now, where they're trying to move away from a negative view on a business. So they do the wholesale change to make it feel ultimately like a new business, albeit the same business. It is purely as a tactical sort of solution to a different sort of negative problem.
So Johnny, in your opinion, what are the most overrated and underrated areas of design? Because speaking from my experience, simply observing different businesses, different marketers, etc., there are some organizations that I see who are always rebranding or always giving their brand a refresh, every couple of years, whatever the case might be. And for me, it's an area where I'm thinking, what are they trying to achieve by doing that? Why is the emphasis all on kind of the visual aesthetic of this brand versus what the brand actually does, what the company actually has to offer to its clients, to its customers, etc.? So for you, what are some of the most overrated and underrated areas of design?
Yeah, I think what you've kind of highlighted there is a very sort of key problem that brands do face. I think that alone is not understanding their audience enough, that they feel that they need to rebrand. Something's not going right, and sometimes it can just be a bit of a sort of an itchy trigger finger to kind of go, well, it's the brand that's not working, so let's change it. And then a year later, after not really giving it too much of a chance, it's, well, the brand's not working again, let's change it again. I think from my perspective, it is take a step back, understand your audience, see what they want. And that's why you could probably take a bit more time up front to do a lot more surveys, a lot more sort of customer research before starting to put and hang so much on the brand and design. I think some of that may be that it's a bit of a trend chaser in terms of they see different businesses doing different things or different competitors doing different things and think they're doing well, let's jump on that sort of bandwagon. Again, it's not really doing your business justice. It's kind of just trying to jump on the back of the coattails of another business that's been successful. And we see it so many times and the discussions we have with businesses where we've kind of say, like, slow down. Like, you don't need to jump on the back of every trend that's out there. You don't need to jump on the back of every design change that goes on within competitors or large businesses, because ultimately they're doing it on the back of research about their customers. Let's take a step back. Let's understand what's going to make the positive impact on your business for your customers. What's your sort of USPs and how can we drive more people towards you? And ultimately just make sure that people feel that your business is on brand of what they'd expect from you, not what they'd expect from somebody else, because it's never going to work. And that's where you see that situation where every year or two somebody's changing their brand, ultimately trying to put in a whole different look and feel, is just because they're just not quite sure what their audience are asking for. And that's where you get that problem.
Yeah, just on that as well, I do appreciate I'm sort of going away here from Johnny's most overrated and underrated areas of design. But just on that as well, for me, I think the reason why it's always stood out is it's kind of counterproductive as well, because when we think about branding, even going back, years and decades in terms of, or centuries even, when we think about the importance of branding and the point of a brand to differentiate yourself from what competitors are doing, what others are doing in the marketplace. And what you just said there about certain organizations jumping on the trends or whatever the latest organization in that space is doing, it's really counterproductive, because now you're not distinguishing yourself from that competitor. You're actually just falling in line almost and becoming just another rather than being the standout.
Yeah, definitely. Your brand is there to build trust with your users, customers, however you kind of want to see that. But you're there to build trust. You're there to gain a sort of loyalty with those users. You might ultimately make that decision to, and businesses do, to change their brand approach to gain a new audience. But what does that mean for your current loyal audience? And are they going to still see your business as the business they trust, the business that they're loyal to? Or are they now going to start thinking, well, you've changed so much, I'm going to go and try something else?
Yeah.
So it is finding that fine balance. And that's where I always think that iterative change of, yes, you're going to have to adapt, you're going to have to look at refreshing parts of your brand. But ultimately, if we can stay away from a wholesale change, unless we absolutely have to, there's always a need for that. But if we can stay away from a wholesale change in the first instance and learn more about what your users want from both your current users and new potential audiences out there, that's where you'll probably find there's a fine line between where we can kind of go with the brand, how we adapt the brand and make it feel more, whether that's on trend or however the new users want to approach it, but keeping and retaining that loyalty, which is obviously your sort of customer base, which is really important.
To go back to the question then, Johnny, overrated and underrated areas of design.
I think if we're looking at specifics in design, which I know is what you're kind of getting at there to put us on the line, I think in terms of overrated design elements to websites, I think it's carousels, things like that, things with scroll, because ultimately you're hiding messages by putting things in carousels at the top of your website. It is quite an outdated approach, I think, where you're getting multiple messages across different screens. Users aren't going to see all of that. They're not here. I've been on websites where there's 10 different carousel elements to click through, and you just hide messages. So I think they're very much overrated. I think in terms of photography as well, I think as much as it might not be seen as an overrated approach, I think stock photography, I think very obvious stock photography is a bit of a killer for brands at the minute. I think people like to feel like your whole brand is being considered. So I think then pulling in those obviously stock photography of people against a coloured background where you can just see it's been downloaded and no considerations being made. I think that's a very overrated sort of approach to design as well. I think these are very sort of outdated solutions to problems where you don't need to spend big on these sort of things. You just need to consider it a little bit more. I think in terms of underrated stuff, I think ultimately it's going to be a bit more of the opposite of that. I think it's going to be simplifying that user journey. It's just a lot of people feel that we need to put a lot in one place, simplify it, strip it back, allow the users to ultimately make their own decisions, but just guide them through that journey and get proper photography.
Yeah.
I think it's always one for us. I think it's something that it can be a big investment at some level for that more considered photography, but the use you're kind of going to get out of it through your brand, through your website, through your print collateral, through your kind of advertising, I think it more than makes up for that.
Yeah, I think it's a good point as well, because thinking about that content, whether it's photo assets or video, etc., it can be repurposed. Different channels for different audiences, different purposes. You can change it for different formats, so there's different key messaging, etc. And I think that is something that's really underrated, probably just across digital generally. Not making the most of that and optimizing what you have. Definitely,
from a video perspective as well. I think what you just touched on there was the different uses of that. I think we've done it previously where we've created like longer video sessions, but used little snippets of that for social media to target different audiences on your different platforms. Then putting different bits on your website, cutting that up, putting it on YouTube, for instance. There is so much you can do with that, but people just don't understand it. You can just create it in one place and then utilize it across the different platforms. Yeah.
So just to summarize then, Johnny, could you just give us a quick overview of those 5 stages then and what we've covered in this session?
So in terms of the 5 sort of key stages of creating a website, it is that analysis. It is understanding your audience, what they want from it, as well as understanding the business and what they want from it, because ultimately that's going to create the best platform. It is then moving that into the structure. So understanding and making sure that that structure flows well. So from wherever a user might land on your website, how are they going to make it through the key stages to make that, whether it's conversion or finding the information that they're looking for. The wireframing stage. So just considering that page structure, that page map, without actually adding in the distractions of color, brand, imagery, things like that. So you can ultimately understand how somebody is going to feel once they land on that page. Are we answering the queries that they have? The design element, that's where we start bringing that brand in, really understanding how we can utilize the brand in that sense and make it feel like a more consistent journey between the different platforms and the channel shift that you might have. And then it's into that sort of technical development set, which then ultimately ends with testing. Once you've got that website and that platform live, it's not a case of leave that for 2, 3, 4, 5 years and then we do the whole exercise again. It is iterative changes to make sure that we're feeding that user with the best user experience, meaning that in the long term, you're not going to have this exercise again in a couple of years' time.
Yeah, I think it's really important as well that when we look at that process, it's not one that has a start point and an end point. It's a cycle as well to continuously test and make those improvements as well. And, not to go too much into how can we test, how can we implement changes, because I appreciate we have Rachel in the next session of this short course to cover that as well. But that in itself is a massively important area, and that kind of can be the birth of everything that we're going to start to do from a design perspective as well, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really at that stage you're understanding the smaller pieces and how your brand really sort of feeds into your audience and how they really start to utilize your platforms, rather than that wholesale change of doing that bigger job. It is really getting down to those micro interactions and how we can better serve the audience.
Perfect. Good stuff. Right. Well, thank you, Johnny, for joining me in this session.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining me, and I'll see you in the next.